Welcome to another episode of the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. Glad to have you along, Mike. Good to see you, or good to hear, well, both see and hear from you again. We are going to be handling Genesis 3, chapter 3, verses 6 through 24, the end of chapter 3. So we'll put our minds and thoughts on chapter 3 today as we go through what's often called the fall of Adam and give our opinions. And again, what I enjoy about you, Mike, and hope this is coming through our times together, is that we don't rehearse these things as much as spend a lot of time thinking about it and then just getting together and talking. And we're doing this again from a Divine Counsel worldview idea, or worldview set up in the sense that there's a lot of ways to talk about Genesis 3, obviously, or any biblical text, and we're not trying to be exhaustive or comprehensive in how we handle the text as much as talk to fellow travelers on this Divine Counsel worldview idea that does have a read on many parts of the Bible that are not traditional. Sometimes they are, sometimes they really are, just what the text has often been understood to mean. But where Mike Heiser drew in a lot of his listeners and readers was just saying, guys, the text is more interesting than you'll ever know if you just look into, what it originally said. And we're in that vein. So when we come to Genesis 3, again, much the same. We are dealing with some texts that there's nothing I need to add or we need to add that's not right in front of us. But sometimes there are some things. And when we get to this text again today, I think we'll find that the Divine Counsel worldview has some things to offer. So good to have you along again, Mike. Hope you're doing well.
Doing well. The Patriots are not doing so well, but,
Did they replace him?
Yes. Like the day after he announced.
That's right. He had something in his contract about that, didn't he? Or the team had something in the contract that they didn't even have to interview outside of the guy they chose. Something like that.
It's something like that. But yeah, it was.
Bill Belichick was.
It was bitter. It was bittersweet.
Did he leave, or was he fired, or who?
It really did sound like it was a mutual decision. This is a little bit of, New England or Boston sports. I know that a lot of people are really big fans of Boston sports. Being sarcastic, but like I'm from Boston. I have to, this is my region of love, and Belichick has been there ever since my entire what I would say adult formative years, right? And so 2000,
right? Did he come?
Yeah, came in 2000 and
24 years ago. Wow.
And just really just transformed the way, because, the Pats people, yay, we have a football team, but initially people were not necessarily going to be upset if the Pats ended up being in Connecticut, because that was actually a possibility. Until we started winning Super Bowls. And then everyone was like, wait, no, you can't leave Massachusetts.
They define the word dynasty, that's for sure.
Yeah. And so
at least they did. We'll see if they get back to those winning ways.
That's a hope.
Minnesotans, we often joke, we learned to count in elementary school 0 and 1, 0 and 2, 0 and 3. So we have a lot of self-respect issues to get through.
Well,
as Viking fans.
For a lot of folks who are locals like me in the Boston area, I've joked and sort of, but also not really joked. I've asked the kind of rhetorical question of, doesn't this kind of feel like Boston sports from the 90s? And it just, that was not a really great time for us.
I understand.
Yeah, so it kind of feels like we're entering that.
Well, we're in it together then. Yeah, as we come on the air, we're in the midst of the playoff season, and we're down to, in fact, today, Saturday, we're having two playoff games today and then 2 tomorrow. So my son's a big Cincinnati Bengals fan, so we went out to a Cincinnati game this year where Vikings and Cincinnati played, and this gets into something I don't want to get into for time, but for the second time that I was there, I'm just going to say this because it's interesting to me theologically. I wanted I'm a Viking fan, he's a Bengal fan, but we are good-natured about it, and but I didn't want to drive all the way home, 12 hours, with Bengals having lost. So The fourth quarter started. The Vikings were up by 14. And I prayed. I said, Lord, I would ask that. Isn't this a proud moment of a father, right? I said, Lord, would you please help Cincinnati win? And the greatest comeback, or the Vikings had not lost a 14-point fourth quarter lead since 1993 until that. So 31 years of history had gone by before they had lost that kind of a lead. And that day they did. And the Lord answered my prayer. Cincinnati won, and we had a nice ride home. That brings us to Genesis 3. And again, listening to you're going to have to pick up the previous podcast to make sense of this, right? That there's we're moving forward with the presumption that you've heard where we've been. So if you could go back and do the previous podcast, that would be very helpful as we pick up Genesis 3 verse 6, which follows 3:5. You will be like, and I'm going to recommend, as we talked about at the end of our last podcast, that what the temptation was to become like a divine being, as the serpent himself was probably, and that's how Adam and Eve knew him or it to be. So he was saying, he was saying, if you eat that tree that Yahweh has told you not to eat, you will become like me, knowing good and evil. So that gives us a hint of what knowing good and evil is. It's something that divine beings have that humans at this point didn't have, or at least this pair of humans did not have. Is that fair enough?
I think that's fair.
They were tempted to become... Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I love how in the last episode you brought out, you kind of teased out more of the implications, right? That I think sometimes gets glossed over when we read these translations, right? Because if it's would be like God with a capital G implying Yahweh, then the serpent is almost promising as though they will be like the uncreated one.
Yeah. Can you imagine Adam and Eve being tempted to be that way? I mean, I just can't imagine that.
Versus, yeah.
They're not, rubbing their hands together saying, I'm going to be like Yahweh. No, that's bizarre to me.
But the other idea, the other option of it being gods or Elohim in the plural, of like all these other spiritual beings, these super powerful divine beings that I see around me that I've chatted before in the garden, because it just happens to be the place where heaven and earth meet. Then, yeah, that would be really cool. That would be really nice.
And I don't want to be telegraph where the story goes, but if you know the biblical story, doesn't this you shall be as gods kind of give away where we're going here? That there at least puts it in your mind like, wow, I wonder what it would be like to become divine. And I'm just going to recommend the Bible story does go that direction. So, and Mish, let me bring up something now that's going to be part of our conversation this time. I don't know where C.S. Lewis brings this up, but it's in one of his many writings. He said, when writing a novel, the gun that's on the mantle may be important or it may not be. You don't know from the first mention, but you will by the second and third and fourth mention. In other words, when you tell a story, it's not the first mention of something that's important, it's the second mention of something. And so what I'd recommend is, as you read the Bible, and again, Mike, give me your thoughts if this is tracking with you or how it tracks with you, that when you read the Bible, it's so tempting because you know the story to anachronistically put things into the story that the reader originally would not have known, right? And here would be a good example that the preacher is tempted to look up and say, guys, here's what's going to happen. And what you don't want to do is like the gun on the mantle. You don't want to say the first time it's mentioned, oh, by the way, this will be the murder weapon, right? You don't want to say that because it's not fair to the storyteller. And I'd recommend that reading the Bible as a story, which it was meant to be understood that way. Think of the original readers, right? And the children sitting around the storyteller, that they were given the story in the pieces they were so that their attention would be in the right place at the right time.
Yes.
And right now, as we start out this story today, the attention of the original reader, and I think even as they're brought into the story of Adam and Eve, would be the temptation to become divine. That's where you are in the story. I would recommend that as huge, shall we again say Midrashic meaning to our world today. When I hear, again, I mentioned last time, I today work for a bank. That's my 8-hour day job. And I like it because, my theology, I can let that be on its own. It doesn't have to, live up to a creedal, confessional thing. No one can fire me for my theology, put it that way. Secondly, though, I find that in the workaday world of my fellow bank employees, they're just like me, even if they're not Christians. How? They have a desire, and see, I want to say to be divine, but that's getting ahead of us. They have a desire to tap into meaning that's beyond the physical world. I think that is very evident within my non-Christian coworkers. They want meaning in life that, you can't put a finger on it. And that's where this story goes. So anyway, what do you think?
I think that the commonality amongst all of us as humans, whether we verbalize that in one way or another, we do suspect that there's something more, right? More than just this physical world. There is more than just simply that 9-to-5 job. There is more than just meeting our physical needs. Here I'm in the Boston area in the Northeast. We're thoroughly now post-Christian, right? We have a very strong Christian heritage. We have the original seminaries that were in the area, like Harvard's here, Yale is in the area. So we have that history, but we are so post-Christian. And yet folks who are here are still longing for something more than just materialism. And they're longing for more than just simply this, well, there is no God. It's just only us. It's only me and my family. We just got to fend for ourselves. They actually want to believe there's something more that will add up beyond just the here and now.
Yeah. And it's all wrapped up in 3:5, right? This is still going on, this desire to tap into a world that you can't touch.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, well, let's do it. 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it was delight to the eyes. Again, I think this is just general replaying the story that it was a beautiful tree. And here it is, that the tree was desired to make one wise because of what the serpent told her. She took of its fruit and ate, and also she gave some to her husband, who was with her. There it is. I mean, I think he was there and listening in and part of the conversation, and he ate too. So they're both doing it together. We're not blaming Eve beyond Adam.
She didn't have to run across the tree ground to get over the fruit to him. That's just a little reference from the past episode, because man, that picture ticked me off when I saw that.
Well, what happens, what's interesting is that what happens is exactly what the serpent said would happen. Mm-hmm. He didn't lie. He actually told them what would happen. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, which in the ancient world just means they understood what they were doing. It's, I don't think this is a physical point. This is more of a mental realization. They knew that they were naked. Now that, again, if you go back to the end of 2, naked and not ashamed, now they know that they're naked and they are ashamed because of what they do, and they run, and we're getting ahead now, but they're running not from each other, but from God, from some kind of physical presence that they were experiencing, which they would understand to be Yahweh. So, and we can hold off on what that physical presence necessarily entailed, but the point is, and I think we're all together on this, when they realize what they did, their ashamedness to be in the presence of their deity, which in this case would be Yahweh, took full form. And they sewed fig leaves together. These are large, fig leaves are very large, size of paper, or like a book leaf out of a book, and made themselves, and that word loincloths often means belt, or as you have in the King James over there, aprons. Again, the pictures that we show our children usually have them covering, their private parts, as it were. I think if you're going to hide yourself from a deity, you're making more than just strips of cloth. You're literally like a tent almost. So I think the word, and it's again, if I ask my computer for it, here are the other ways that Hebrew word, which is chagor, is used: belt, armor, belt, and tie, or tie sackcloth. So the idea that it's common, I wouldn't say it's a common word. At the same time, I'm pushing it if I say they made themselves tents under which they could hide. At the same time, I think that's the point, right? They're not trying to hide parts of their bodies from each other. They're trying to hide from the deity that they have offended. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think is going on. They heard, this is an interesting verse, 3:8. They heard the sound, and that word kol is just the normal word for sound. Yep. These are all very normal words that are interestingly, given a lot of meaning in our storybooks that probably don't fit in here. So let's go through it. They heard the sound of the Yahweh Elohim. So there must be some physical way. Let's back up. You've often heard growing up, and maybe you were there, Mike, I know I was, that I had this story in my head that every afternoon at 4:00, Yahweh went on walks with Adam and Eve, that they had this, walking relationship. That's nowhere in the text. It doesn't say that they had a regular occurrence, where they walked and talked and had, coffee and tea or things like that. That when it's one of those rumors that when you go back and look at the Bible, it's not there. Where we get that idea from is here, that they heard the sound of Yahweh Elohim walking in the garden, and then you could put in parentheses, as they often did.
Yeah.
Or like this is, it's their regular attending 3:00 appointment to have a walk. Well, all it says is, as it sounds here, they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden. And the word walking, look at the bottom there, halak. I can do it for time. If you look up halak, very common word, 600 and very top right of my screen, 679 times. It's a very common word. It often translates as walked. But notice even in Genesis 5:22, it's not referring to the physical act of walking as much as a way of, let's look at how else it's translated. Halak can be translated as continually. The waters continued to abate. Mm-hmm. Genesis 8:5. Abraham went. Lot went with him. So it might include walking, it might include horseback riding. In other words, it's not the physical act as much as, and you can walk your way through that word, departed, so forth and so on. So let's get off it now. But the point is, when you hear the word walking here, and notice it is in the Old King, or it's in the Old King James. I wonder if the New King James says walking as well. Yeah, see, it's just a traditional idea. But it just means going. So you could say, let's try this out. They heard the sound of Yahweh Elohim going. Going how? I don't know. There's some kind of sound going here in the garden. Notice again that word cool of the day. That's just a translational decision, because the actual word, if you look at the bottom there, ruach. Oh, ruach. Well, that's the word for spirit, for wind. Mm-hmm. So here's how, notice ruach is used in Genesis 1:2, translated as spirit. Now it's used in 3:8, translated as cool. Usually breath. Again, it's 375 times. Very common word, often meaning wind or spirit. That's the most common use of the term. But notice this, at the blast of your nostrils. The word can also mean blew with your wind. And it's in Jeremiah. Do you mind if I go looking here just a second? I know it's in Jeremiah somewhere. A hot wind at that time. There is in Jeremiah. I don't know if it matters which one it is. The wind is, in fact, it's kind of implied in Jeremiah here, a hot wind from the bare heights. The word ruach is used in Jeremiah a couple of times, or maybe several times, to indicate not this, again, beautiful, breezy time of the afternoon where the winds are gentle and good time to fly a kite. That the word is used in a anger sense of blasting. Okay, so let's read it that way. They heard the sound of Yahweh God going in the garden at the blast of the day, or in the time of day when it's not safe to be in the wind. In other words, this is not a good word I would recommend. So, in other words, it's just, this is anger, or this is a nervousness time, and that's why they hid themselves. So, is that making sense? So,
Can I?
I think it's trying to. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I do lean towards that. There is this sense of judgment is about to happen.
Yes, they knew judgment was in the air.
Yeah,
how's that?
Judgment was in the air.
Whatever you do with the cool of the day, it's not a good thing. It's a bad thing.
And also, I mean, just for the sake, because this gets into a little bit of the grammar, right? The word, yes, is walking, but it is particularly in the hifpael, form. And in the hifpael, there is this idea of, and where people get the idea of like, oh, every 4 p.m. God will come and walk. Mm-hmm. You even saw that when we were looking up the word, and there was Enoch continued, or there's this idea of continuousness. There's this repeatable pattern. So it's a repeatable walking that he had done.
Okay.
And so I think that's where that idea comes from. But yes, it takes it a little far when we start making into like, oh, it's his favorite afternoon time of walking.
Yeah. Well, whatever we do with 3:8, they're nervous, they're scared, and they hid themselves from the presence. Notice what that nakedness causes them to do, not hide from each other or feel bad about their bodies. That's not the point. It's that they are nervous to be in the presence, and that word just means, panim in Hebrew just means, it physically means face, but it often means the idea of being in front of someone, standing directly in front of them, and that's what they're afraid of. So now that does then hint very strongly that they had been in the presence of God before this. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been hiding now, right? So they must have had some previous experience of being in the presence of Yahweh God, which I have. Again, let's hang on to that idea for our further walks into Genesis, including most likely Genesis 16:18, where Abraham meets the angel of Yahweh, and we have to talk through the issue of, or at least discuss the angel of Yahweh and the presence of Yahweh and that kind of stuff. So we can hold off on that for there. They hid themselves in the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden, but God called to the man and said, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard," he just repeats what we've heard, "the sound of you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked. And I hid myself." In other words, I think he knows he disobeyed.
Yeah.
And if that's all we need, that's fine. That the story works with that understanding that the woman and the man realize, even though what the serpent said was true, he didn't lie at that point. They have done something to oppose what God had asked them to do. He said, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree?" And again, it makes it look like God is a little bit clueless, right? Like, where are you? What do you mean? And no, this is how, if we can say, the narrator tells the story for the sake of getting all this information out. And so it's not as though God is asking with ignorance behind it. I think he knows, but he's just trying to elicit the story.
I think there's also,
the man said the woman,
there's also that need to have, because we are reading narrative, we need to have something that initiates dialogue response, right? And so, and also just on from more, maybe something that's maybe people that can, see it from more of a ground level. This is, I would almost like parallelize this to like how parents, when they catch their children with their hands in the cookie jar, it's not that the parent does not know that, like, where did all these cookies come from? Like, it's not that they really have no idea or no clue, but they're trying to get the child to respond back and to give them the opportunity. Will you be honest with me? Will the relationship between you and I be easily reconciled, or are we going to have to take some more serious measures or more serious talk?
Did you follow Calvin and Hobbes, or do you know what?
Yeah,
I'm
I
talking
used
about?
I used to read Calvin and Hobbes. Yeah.
Oh man, it's my favorite by far, and one of my favorite strips was he's pounding nails into the dining room table. And his mother says, she comes in screaming, "What are you doing?" And he looks at her and says, "Is that a trick question?" Like, of course you know what I'm doing. He was dumbfounded by the question, but yeah, that's a good point. So the woman now again, we've heard sermons on this, that men like to blame women and women like to blame snakes. No, we're all shifting the blame. That might be a midrashic spin on this. That's fine if people want to run with that. In this case, it does happen. Doesn't always have to happen, but in this case, the man blames the Isha. Mm-hmm. The Ish blames the Isha. And the woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit, which is in a sense true. So I'm not defending Adam at all. But again, the story is told with the intent of keep moving. Then the Lord God said to the woman, what is this you have done? The woman, again, given a chance to explain herself, she says, well, and it is true, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. Well, the deception was not in what would happen. The deception was in implying that Yahweh God had withheld the tree for nefarious reasons. Mm-hmm. And she's realizing, I think, a lot's coming to her mind here, that she was not in the right because she didn't believe that God's, for whatever reason, the command would stick. The Lord God said to the serpent, let's break, by the way, notice it's put into both the ESV and the New King James, place this text into poetic genre. Mm-hmm. You can tell by how it's, the lines are placed poetically. Understand that as you look at the Hebrew on the right, there is no such genre identification. You simply have the text. So where poems occur in the Bible is, again, an interpretive discussion. And it's a fun one. If you get into poetry discussion at all, what counts as a poem makes huge difference to the interpretation. My favorite is in Judges, is it 4? You have the story of Ehud being, Jael pounding Sisera's head into the tent floor, after he had asked for water and she gave him milk. Remember that story of the story of Jael. And then in 5, you have a poem, a poetic rendition of the same story. And, she pounded and he fell. She pounded and he fell. It makes it sound like it was this actual process of pounding this guy's head into the ground. And he'd get up and she'd pound it again. No, that's just the poem. And the point being, and I often bring this up to the student, that if you want to know what happened, you go to Judges 4. If you want to get the emotional sense of what happened, go to Judges 5, because there you have the story of Sisera's mother looking out the lattice of the window saying, why is he so late in coming? Oh, he must be getting a girl or two. And the spoil, right? Dividing the spoil. Well, did that happen? I'd say no. In other words, we don't have to have a woman looking out her window saying, why is my son so long in coming home? But the poet has a right to put her in because of the emotion of that story. So what I'm just recommending, and there is a point to my point, that because this is, and I'd agree, this is poetical thoughts put into poetry. There's going to be rhythm, there's going to be allusion, there's going to be a genre difference between this and if this was a syllabus where you hand something to someone and say, get this down in black and white, right? It's not a narrative, it's a poetic reading, which is meant to, if you know where I'm going with this, poetry often has meaning in itself, but it points beyond itself. And you're supposed to take a poem, I shot an arrow into the air, and you're supposed to appreciate not the arrow, you're supposed to appreciate where this goes in your own understanding of life and the meaning of life and all that. So I say all that to say this, that when he says to the serpent, and then he says in 16, to the woman, and then to Adam, 3:17. So we have three objects of God's direct words.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to call it cursing, the curse upon the serpent, the curse upon the woman, be careful because the text does not curse, or the word curse is not in the text. Just realize that.
Well, except for the serpent.
At least we have that to. Yeah, I think we do. Okay. Thank you. He does. Yeah, somewhere along there, maybe there. Cursed is the ground. Okay, so yeah, he doesn't curse Adam, doesn't curse Eve. He curse the.
He does curse the serpent because you have done this in the ESV.
You are cursed. There it is. Cursed are you. Okay, thank you. That's I knew I wanted to figure out or pull back from the idea that Adam andEve were cursed, and that's fair.
And can I actually, I'm kind of curious about your thought on this too, because So as I was doing my Hebrew track, like I was using Logos and I'm using the Hebrew tools and everything like that, and I realized as I was going through my course, ironically with Dr. McDowell, whom we've mentioned before, she would start mentioning, and we obviously know that this text here is in poetry, and I was so confused, because I would be looking at my Logos display of the Hebrew. And so I'm kind of wondering if that's what's happening in accordance, that everything was line by line, verse by verse. And so I couldn't tell, how do you know that that is in poetry? And then I break out my physical BHS, like the Hebrew Bible,
Mm-hmm.
the critical text of the Hebrew Bible, that all of our translations generally are based off from.
And I'm looking for mine as you speak.
Yeah, and so then I turned to the page, to the chapter, the book, chapter, and verse that she was talking about, and I realized the way that the Masoretic text is formatted, there is actually indentation to indicate this is poetry. And so...
Okay, well, the Masoretes then would have interpreted that way,
and so
which, again, that would be an interpretive call.
Yeah, they made the interpretive call, and so in some sense... It was just an interesting moment where I realized, okay, so I will never be able to actually get rid of a physical copy of the Hebrew scriptures.
Good point.
Because I will always need to reference that to make sure, am I looking at the correct genre?
Yeah, and but do you still agree with my point that, and again, not a leading question here, but do you agree that the original Hebrew or proto-Hebrew that Moses would have used, and who knows again what language he was speaking in here, it's eventually, now it's in our text as even a modern Hebrew text, but whatever language Moses was writing in originally, they probably did not have a poetical indication. It was, you have to listen to it and then decide, with the parallelism attached and such.
I think
this is a poem.
I think that is fair. And when I started doing my Hebrew courses, because man, the Hebrew track was really difficult at Gordon. It's a good thing. I'm glad that it is, but it was really difficult. And one of my friends who went through all the stuff at Gordon, he also got his MDiv years earlier than me. One of the things that really encouraged me and helped me realize, okay, I'm not crazy for why I feel this way at times, was Hebrew is a very oral language, and it was meant to always be spoken and heard. And so I have a suspicion that as this was told, there was something in the speaker's inflection or intonation, that there was something to let you know in the rhythm, we're listening to poetry. We're not just listening to just a bare narrative. We're listening to something that can be considered poetry, and eventually the Masoretes, whether they're always correct or not, they made the call that when it's being written into a written text, we have to somehow indicate to the reader, you're now hitting what we suspect is poetry.
Yeah. In fact, and I'm typing in front of you, so I apologize, but when you bring up Psalm 119, again, written now, this is how it would be on the right. This is how it's displayed in the Masoretic text printed version. And maybe just because the lines allow it, but notice it, and you don't see this in English. Here's my point, that in English, you're going to see a text like Psalm 119, blessed, blessed, who, you, oh, then, I. But in Hebrew, every first letter that I just mentioned is this same aleph.
Yep.
Every word of the first 8 verses starts with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Which is just genius.
Every word of the second 8 verses, verses 9 through 16, begin with a bait.
Yep.
But when you come to the English, it's not going to translate.
No.
Right? So the Hebrew speaker would know you're dealing in poetry by the sound, and this is often common in Hebrew poetry. It's the initial sound that repeats itself. Not, how in English we rhyme at the end of a word. They would often have a physical sound that began the word that would be consistent. So anyway, long way of saying that in Hebrew, I think it'd be a lot easier to know if you're dealing in poetry or not. And I'm recommending that, yes, this is, and as both our 2 English Bibles here show, that this is probably poetic, meaning, okay, here we go. Look out for some allusions, some metaphors, similes, and all that stuff that poetry is known for. So let's do it. God said to the serpent, not to Satan. He said it to the serpent, because you have done this. And how do I know it's not Satan? Because listen to what he says. Because you've done this, cursed you are above all livestock, above all the beasts. That's a snake situation. That's not a divine being. In other words, I think he's talking, I'm showing my hand, Mike, but I really think he's talking to the serpent here. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat. Everything you eat is going to have a flavor of dust on it all the days of your life. So is it fair to say that, at least in the initial reading of 3:14, Yahweh has cursed, and the word is used there, cursed the serpent that the divine being spoke through? Fair enough? I think it's there.
I think that's fair. I think, though, there is, because it also is poetry, right? We got potentials for illusion, symbology that's happening here. Double entendres. Like there's ways to start realizing. But the serpent was already creepy crawling on the ground. So wasn't it already eating the dust? So what is the emphasis of it eating the dust?
And this brings up an excellent question that, again, the average college freshman's asking. Well, did it walk on all fours before this point? Most commentators, I don't know what you've read, Mike, on this, but most commentators would admit the serpent was the serpent before this. And what's happening is, it's called an etiology in ancient literature or literature, where the story goes, here is the curse that you are experiencing and why. This is why you go on your belly, because you have done this. In other words, it didn't start here on a Tuesday afternoon. The reason you are, and I know it sounds in English as though you shall go. I haven't studied the Hebrew enough to know. And again, because it's in poetic form, it probably has a present sense to it. But the point is that he probably was crawling. I mean, in my mind's eye, he's already crawling. Mm-hmm. And that God is explaining to him why he's crawling, because you've done this. So you don't have to have a change in the biology of snakes in 3:14. 15, I will put enmity, and I put it in yellow because it's such a famous verse. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring. And that word is singular because like herd of sheep, you say herd and you mean plural sheep, but the word is singular. Fair enough. It's a singular word with the multiple meaning behind it. Between your offspring and her offspring. So far, let's keep going. He shall bruise your head. He being the offspring, singular here because it was singular here. Your offspring will bruise your head, and you shall bruise her offspring's heel. So let me just deal with the poetics first, or what I'm recommending. Well, let me just throw it at you, Mike, and you can respond. If I'm Eve and Adam listening to this, what I took away from this would be, I'm now going to not have a friendly relationship with this serpent anymore. Whatever relationship they had, we don't know, but it was enough that they had a conversation, right, about the tree. So now we're going to have a situation where the woman and her children, so that would be a way of saying humanity to follow, will have this enmity between you. So you're not going to have pet snakes as a general rule. When I've said that in a classroom, people usually put their hand up and say, my uncle's neighbor's brother-in-law has a snake. And okay, I understand. But the point is, as a dog and a cat are common, no, this is not going to be the way it's going to be. There will not be friendship between humans and snakes. That's how I take the first two lines, because it's poetry. Okay. And then in a parallel fashion, explaining in literal terms what's happening figuratively, your relationship will be, they're going to go around stamping on your head and you're going to go around snipping at their heels. In other words, the second half of the verse explains in literal form, poetic literal form, how the first half of the verse is going to look. You are not going to keep talking as friends. You are now going to be reduced to the level of having your head treaded underfoot. That's how the Peshitta translation even translates this, that your head will be treaded underfoot by human beings. So fair enough. Before we jump into any kind of future, the gun's on the mantle, how will that gun get used later in the story question, as we talked about before. Right now, the gun's on the mantle, but we're not talking about it. We're just saying, here's the story so far. Your friendship is now over, and you are going to be limited in this relationship to people trying to stomp on your head and you trying to bite their heel in return. What do you think?
I think that's fair. I mean, and that's like one level of the poetry that, I was just even thinking, from the kind of audience that was probably listening to us, if they were wandering in the wilderness and they would often be, sleeping on the ground wherever they're taking a stop, and they wake up in the morning and a snake bit them right on the head because they were lying on the ground. That the almost immediate response is grab the snake that just bit your head and then stomp on it, because that hurt.
Yeah.
And so I could see it at that
kid,
one level of okay, you're just taking a sort of a lived out reality that we experience on a day-to-day basis. Always that kind of thing, that a snake could always bite us on the head because we foolishly put our heads and our whole bodies lying down on the ground horizontally.
Yeah. Or, well, again, the normal relationship is I remember this as a kid when I was mowing my lawn and my family. It was my job to mow the back area, which was quite a large, expansive area. And I often would meet a garter snake. And of course, the only way you can get them, they fascinated me, so I'd follow behind them. And this picture of me stamping at where I thought their head would be or going to go is just in my memory. And that was our relationship between me and those snakes. Was I'm pounding away trying to stamp on their head. His relationship with me was the only thing available to him to get was my heel, right? In other words, that very poetic way of saying it is, this is no fun relationship. Me stamping on your head and you bruising my heel. But by the way, the word bruise is just repeated twice. And again, same way, Hebrew word, shuf.
Yep.
So there's probably no theology. Here's my point. And then we can get off it, or actually get onto it more, is in the original reading of this to Adam and Eve, if they were overhearing this, they would have taken it to mean we're going to not have any friendship. That's it. Now, the question of how did later readers take this? Okay, in other words, there's different levels to this. If I'm Moses and I am writing this down and then it's being passed on to my family and we have parents reading this to their children, and Mike and I disagreed on this. I remember one time we were rooming together at ETS, and again, what I loved about Mike was his laugh. It wasn't dismissive, but it was, I could tell whenever he would, how do you say it? As friendships go, I could tell when he laughed because he thought my idea was weird or wrong. How's that? And the lights were off and we were staring at the ceiling and in our beds and we're talking theology as normal. And I said, and we got into this, Genesis 3:15. And I said, my view is that it just means that women and their kids won't like snakes. And I remember him laughing at it saying, but there's more. There's more to this than that. And my point to him was, and which I'll make now, if there is more to it, I'm going to wait until the text does it for me. Because like I said in the analogy of the gun on the mantle, I am told by the writer that the gun's there, but I'm not told why until he wants me to know. And maybe I can think about it. Maybe I'm supposed to wonder, but I'm not going to stop and tell the child who I'm reading the book to, hey, do you know why the gun's there? Because in chapter 14, it's going to get used. So here's my point, and I made this to Mike, and again, we disagreed. To me, the story is giving it this way, and it doesn't want me as the reader, especially if I'm telling it to a child. It does not want me to go ahead of the story and say, this is going to be Jesus. Because if I do, I might be right, but I'm not following the story as the story's given. That's my only concern. So do you see where I'm going with this, Mike? If I was preaching this on a Sunday morning and I came to Genesis 3:15, would I mention Jesus? Personally, I wouldn't. I would say, what you have in the story so far, stay with me, stay with the writer, you have a story of a reversal. A reversal of what was good is now bad. That's all you've got. And it's a shocking reversal, right? Because I don't think they saw this coming. So the shock value of the story so far is not that there will be a Messiah figure who will, whatever. The shock value is, right as it says, I'm going to be reduced to getting bit on the heel by this being that I had previously been friendly with. What do you think?
I think I think the way that we describe what you're saying, the caveat is that especially if this is the first reading, right? If we're just trying to become adequately, informed about the story, then you have to move along with the pace of the story, right? So if we're going with like your approach, then yes, this is what it appears to be the initial relationship, right? And I have read some other scholars who've pointed out that in many ways, one of the things that went wrong with what woman and man did was that they were supposed to be able to express dominion and control over creation and other animals. And they were supposed to only listen to God alone. Here, instead, they're listening to the serpent, which is a reverse of what they ought to be doing. Mm-hmm. And so then there is this kind of, now you're reaping the consequences of what happens when you're not following that kind of economy of God. And so that's like how some scholars would go about it. What you're alluding to.
And that's fair that.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's fair to how poetry is meant to be understood.
Yeah.
It's on levels, right?
It's on levels. And I think there is, that's the challenge is, for us as Christians, right? We have that moment where Jesus says on the Emmaus Road, as he opens up the scriptures to those two disciples, the scriptures speak of me. And we can go into a long discussion about what does that mean. But that's always like the challenge that, especially me as a guy that's in a doctorate program that's about preaching.
I know.
Is how do you preach the Old Testament in a way that points people back to Jesus? Because ultimately in the end, right, we don't have 20 hours so I can sit people down and just say, let's go through all of the Old Testament, but I have to give them.
See, now that is now you're scratching where I'm itching. Let me explain why. Okay. Thank you. That's exactly how I wanted, or I wanted to get into that side of it. And you, again, without rehearsal, you brought it up. In Matthew or Luke 24, Jesus says, he tells the Emmaus disciples, the Old Testament was about me. And granted, how much money would you pay to hear that conversation, right? What's missing out of that is what Jesus actually said. So we don't know where he went back and said, that's me or that's me. So we all use that verse to defend to defend our view of where Jesus was or was not, because of that verse that, by the way, doesn't tell us anything. So where I'm nervous personally is and I buy these books because I love reading about the Bible. But I sometimes buy a book, especially an introductory book, for seminarians, because I disagree with it so vehemently. And I just want to have it on my shelf to remember what I don't believe, right? And this is a current thing within, and let me just throw it out here, because you're familiar with it, because you're in seminary, and you'll be around it the rest of your life, that the current fad seems to be, the more I can find Jesus in the Old Testament, the better I am. Not necessarily the better moral person, but just the better theologian I am. In other words, I'm going to show you how good I am. There seems to be this fad out there that I'm going to read the Old Testament as a Christian messianically, and I'm going to find places in the Old Testament where others haven't found Jesus, but I can. And I understand the value, sense of that. The other part of me, maybe 80% of me, recoils at that because of this kind of verse, because of the gun on the mantle story, or more literally would be the lamppost in Narnia. Okay, I have not read, and I'm waiting to my retirement, I think, to read the Chronicles of Narnia past The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. I have not read them purposely because I want to save those 6 books that I have not read. I've read the first. I want to read them at my leisure when I can just enjoy the story. And don't tell me, I've been told that the lamppost that Susie meets in the beginning of The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe has further meaning than originally I would get in that book. And my point is, when I read The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, there's a lamppost. Well, I don't know anything about it. It's just, it's there. Well, someday, I can't wait to find out what the meaning of the lamppost is. But that's the beauty of reading the story that way. And when you say, and I appreciate it, that, I can't take 20 hours and go through the whole story, yeah, I understand. At the same time, isn't that what the Bible's for? That I'm supposed to, do I really want to join this family called the Abrahamic family that's been promised to inherit the world? My answer would be, if you want to, get ready for the study of your life, because you've got a Bible that's long, it's difficult, but it's beautiful. And if you take your time with that story, it's going to be a really cool ending. Well, what I'm not going to do, this is my personal view, I'm not going to tell you how the story ends until the story ends. In other words, Jesus won't, okay, let me make my last point and then shoot back. If I'm preaching the Old Testament, I probably will never bring up Jesus. I just won't, because the story doesn't. Now, will it tell me who Yahweh is? Absolutely. His grace, his mercy, his love, his forgiveness, how to be right with God, how to be loyal to one God above another, all those Old Testament themes, which are pounded into me as I read through the Old Testament story. I'm going to be, even the agents that God uses, a Michael, a Gabriel, a prophet, those kind of things are going to be part of the story, so that when I come to Matthew 1:1 and this virgin has a baby, I'll say, wait a second. Is that the messenger of Malachi 3? Is that the prophet of Deuteronomy 18? In other words, if I know my story well enough, boy, will I be ready for this Jesus. I'm going to want him so bad. And my burden, my concern is that we preload Jesus into stories so quickly that, I don't know, just that we lose the story.
I think what you're expressing, I think ultimately in the end, you and I do agree, because and this is the challenge, right? Like when I was doing my first cohort this past June, the guest teacher that our overseeing professor brought in, he was really big on Christocentric preaching, especially from the Old Testament. And he just simply, hey, this is my view. I'm just going to present it. This is how I try to do it. This is how I try to find, somehow bring the text to talk about Jesus in the end. And it's not just inserting Jesus in there. It's a lot more nuanced, and I really appreciate what he presented. But I also had, struggled, and I pushed back on, I think the better approach, if we're honest, especially if we're preaching from the Old Testament, is not to go with a Christocentric type of preaching, but a theocentric type of preaching. Because at least in my context of where I am, in a very post-Christian region, most people don't know anything about God at all. Right. And so
sad. I shouldn't laugh. It's so sad.
But it's just simply like, I actually have to bring up just God, let alone Jesus. And I need to even just teach the basic concept of who Yahweh is, and that he's uncreated. Right. He didn't have a beginning. Like, I have to actually go to such basic foundational things that a lot of people who have grown up more in a Christianized region or familiar with Christianese is more used to. But I'm in a region where I can't assume that. And so that was kind of my pushback. And, it was good dialogue, good conversation. And I think, but there are moments just like that sermon I've been talking about in our last couple of episodes. Like, when I got to 15, there were a few things, because again, I have a limited amount of time. And I would love it if everyone could take the time to mull over the scriptures. And that's actually part of the strategy in preaching, is that you're trying to get people enticed to really show them, like, there is a deliciousness of actually meditating upon the scriptures, and let me show you what happened when I did this, and hopefully try to encourage them to do it for themselves too. But I know some of them, they will never turn and open up a physical Bible, because especially now, we don't have physical Bibles as often. Everyone will just go right to their phone, and if they're good, they'll open up a Bible app, and hopefully they won't turn to some other app.
Right, man.
Right, and so it's that tension. And so when I got to 3:15, I put it in because, one, I basically preached from 3:1 to 7, so it's super heavy. It's depressing. And so there was that need of also, like, hey, if there is any opportunity, if there's any sort of hope, and also sort of the pushback against this sense of, well, it's the woman's fault. It's totally her fault for why we're here. And to point out to people that what God is saying to the serpent, like, if we take the few layers above in this tiramisu, then there's something about what her offspring, and it's strange, it's her offspring, not the man's. It's her offspring that will ultimately deliver some sort of blow to the serpent. And, I alluded to Jesus, and disagree or agree, but I felt there was a need, because of just knowing the context of who I'm dealing with and the people who are coming to my church. I need to get them to at least realize, we're talking about Jesus, because we're a church that wants people to know who he is. And so we believe, from multiple layers of this tiramisu, because many of us have eaten it. And if you're new to it, just know we're talking about Jesus, and we're gonna say enough. This is Jesus, and this is a proto-gospel, or just an allusion, a hint. And so if you want to read the story,
it's often called the proto-gospel.
And read the story, and you'll see these allusions and connections, and how even Old Testament writers later on would allude to some idea of a person that looks like or resembles a snake, or shining like a snake, and something about their head is being done. and just over and over again, you get these. It's like, well, that's weird, huh?
Yeah.
But it's never direct quotes. It's just this imagery that pops up in your mind, and it's supposed to leave you wondering. And then you get to the New Testament, and you're just like, holy cow, what's happening here?
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for that illustration. Again, I'm so glad that you have that pastoral experience not in your past, but presently. I mean, your feet are on the ground and you know what this is like. Can I quote from a book? Again, I recommend it highly. Anything Lewis writes, C.S. Lewis, Reflections on the Psalms. It's obviously a book that's not about Genesis, but in chapter 10 of his C.S. Lewis, Reflections on the Psalms, it's near the end of his book, and he says, I'm going to now turn to something far more difficult. And he talks about, let me paraphrase him, some Psalms have been believed to contain a second or hidden meaning, an allegorical sense, concerned with the central truths of Christianity, incarnation, passion, resurrection, so forth. The full significance of what writers are saying is, on this view, apparent only in the light of events which happened after they were dead. So his point of chapter 10 is, he calls it second meanings. How do we handle Psalms that have a meaning that is going to be used in the New Testament to speak about Jesus? That's ultimately where he's going. Yeah. What he does is just brilliant. And again, he's doing it from a literary background that he had, but he's applying it to the story. And I'm again going to shorten this up, but please read it, chapter 10 of Reflections on the Psalms. He says, there's different ways to look at this because, one, you could say something, think of the average story, where you say something, sure is hot today, and the guy you said it to ended up dying in a furnace blast. Well, that was just dumb luck. In other words, you could argue if that was in a story that was prophetic. Well, no, it was said in pure coincidental meaning. And he goes through an illustration of this in a Roman historian thing. He mentions, by the way, Virgil, the Roman writer. Virgil, writing not very long before the birth of Christ, begins a poem thus, quote, "The great procession of the ages begins anew. Now the Virgin returns, the reign of Saturn returns, and the new child is sent down from high heaven," unquote. That's a pagan saying that. Mm-hmm. And he says this, the resemblance to the birth of Christ would be regarded as an accident. In other words, it's extraordinary luck. You could say that Virgil is talking about the birth of, quote, a virgin gives birth and, this God comes down from the high heaven. But then he said, this is Lewis, he says, wait a second. Sometimes people can speak of, quote, what is truer and more important than he or she knows. Yep. It does not seem to me that they could do so by chance. And his illustration would be this. Presume for a moment a man knows, a great biologist illustrating the relation between animal organisms and their environment invents for this purpose a hypothetical animal adapted to a hypothetical environment. Later, we find a creature very like it. This resemblance is not in the least accidental. Insight and knowledge, not luck, led to his invention. The real nature of life explains both why there is such a creature in the universe and why also there was such a creature in his lectures. If, while we reread the lectures, we think of the reality, we are not bringing arbitrary fancies of our own to bear on the text. The second meaning is congenial to it. Then he quotes Plato. Plato in his Republic is arguing that righteousness is often praised for the rewards it brings, honor, popularity, and the like, but that to see it in its true nature, we must separate it from all these, strip it naked. He, Plato, asks us therefore to imagine a perfectly righteous man treated by all around him as a monster of wickedness. We must picture him, still perfect, while he is bound, scourged, and finally impaled. At this passage, unquote. At this passage, a Christian reader starts and rubs his eyes. What is happening? Yet another of these lucky coincidences of a ancient writer? But presently he sees that there is something here which cannot be called luck at all. Plato is talking and knows he is talking about the fate of goodness in a wicked and misunderstanding world. It is the very same thing of which that passion of Christ is the supreme illustration. Again, Lewis, you have to read him on his own words to appreciate him. But here's Lewis's point there that I'm going to apply to Genesis 3:15. Oh, by the way, before I do, I put on the screen your point, Mike, that today's culture doesn't understand who even God is. And I think we have to do this in the story of the Bible is go back to, this is Exodus 34. This is before Jesus comes to the world. The Lord descended in a cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name or the character of Yahweh. Yahweh passed before Moses and proclaimed, the Lord, a God. And here's my point. Would you have guessed this in God telling us who he is well before Jesus ever came to the world? Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. In other words, these are not New Testament doctrines. Yep. This is Old Testament stuff. And I think what we miss often in the story of telling Jesus too quickly is that we make him the gracious one and Yahweh's the angry one. And yet, if we'll watch the story, Yahweh is very, very gracious. So gracious, in fact, that brings tears to your eyes, right? So the point is, if we come back to Genesis 1, let's get back to where we were, that in Genesis 3:15, sorry about this, there we come, that if we want to bring Jesus into it, do it carefully. Do it because you have good reason to. It wasn't, to use Lewis's point, the writer didn't realize possibly how prescient he was God's the writer. He's the one saying this. So that's what's often difficult about this. God said this. So did God say it to be understood in Messianic terms, or did God say it with a wink, knowing? I think the first theologian to pick up on this was Augustine. No New Testament writer quotes Genesis 3:15, which shows to me that they hadn't made that connection yet. That's going to take some time in the history of the Christian church. But when it's finally made by Augustine or whoever does it first, it's picked up on, and now today it becomes what we call the proto-evangelium, the first gospel message. So thank you for your thoughts, Mike. Again, I know as a preacher, we are under obligation to say as much as we can within the 45 minutes we have. We feel obliged to, and so I sense the difference. I guess I'm just saying, if I'm going to take people through this story, I would be more comfortable leaving it with the awkwardness of a woman who used to like the serpent is now abhorrent to it, and see what happens, from here.
And can I just inject something that I remember Mike Heiser would say, right? Because he believes that, yes, this is a proto-gospel or proto-evangelium, right? But he then asked the question of, well, how is that actually really applied by New Testament writers? And the only real verse that has an inkling, an illusional connection was in Romans 16 towards the end, when Paul says, "May the God of peace crush Satan underneath your feet."
Right.
And that was what I remembered the first time, because I had also heard proto-evangelium, this is the proto-gospel, even that old Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ, and he has a moment where poor little garden snake he had.
I remember that stomp.
Yeah, and he had Jesus stomp on a snake that was trying to crawl up to him. It was very artistic. It was very okay, we're getting to who's going to be the real serpent head crusher, right? It's him. It's Jesus right there, and yet, to your point, Ron, right? There is no direct quoting. Mm-hmm. But the closest that we get is that moment where Paul says it's actually the whole entire body of Christ. The representation of the Jesus community that God, and it's not even us really crushing, it's that may the God of peace crush Satan underneath our feet, meaning is we're not actively trying to stomp Satan. God actually will do that, but he'll put him under our feet. It's this really kind of funny imagery.
It's Midrash. Is that fair to say? That Paul is Midrashing in Romans 16:20. He's doing a Midrash in Genesis 3:15.
Yeah.
Here's again, thank you. And here's where my mind always goes to. Paul wrote that to a group of about 100 people living in Rome. Mm-hmm. So, and that's 57 AD. Did it take that long to that few people for people to figure out Genesis 3:15? That, was Paul trying to say, hey guys, would the watching world please listen to me? Here's what Genesis 3:15 means. I'm finally solving it for everybody. No, I think Paul is doing a midrash to a group of people that he enjoys talking about the Bible, and he sees it in that. So, and so I'm not, again, trying to dismantle what we're saying, but the reticence of any New Testament writer for using this verse for what now today is used as an obvious, that God, this is Jesus. I would side with the person in the audience who would say, well, okay, I guess now that you know the whole story, I can see how it connects. But I was going to say, as we talked off the air, I'm doing a Sunday school class starting tomorrow at my church, and we're going to do Genesis. And so it's an adult Sunday school class. It's going to take verse by verse, same thing we're doing here. Mm-hmm. So you can guess when we get to 3:15, I'll have to, I'll have the same conversation all over with 20 some adults. So
I think,
should we finish it up?
Yeah, I just think that us as those of us who are in practicing ministry, or even though you're not a full-time pastor anymore, even when you do go up and speak, there is that need. I want to be able to encourage and help my community, and I think there is that. What you describe, and I personally also don't like it too, is just we're just going to instantly insert Jesus into here, or we're just going to give you the quick answer. And the way I would describe it is in food terms. It's the difference between a person that has gone through the trouble of cooking a meal that took several hours, of getting all the ingredients, of chopping it all up and doing all the proper techniques to cook it well and provide you a loving, hot, home-cooked meal, or driving down to the McDonald's that's across, on the corner of the street, picking up a cheeseburger and then just plopping it down with still the wrapping around it and here, enjoy. It's still substance. It's still food. You can still get something out of it, out of both of them. Yeah. But there is a difference in taking the time to really show people the big narrative story of what's going on in the scriptures versus I'm just going to give you the Cliff Note answer because and as though I don't value this time.
And another example that my kids would understand is back in my day, we opened up a map, laid it across the whole front seat of the car to figure out how to get downtown Minneapolis, right? Now you put it in your phone. Do I want my kids to have the ease of a phone map? Absolutely. What they're missing is Minneapolis. They have no idea how it's laid out, how 694, 74 miles wraps around the entire city and all the hubs that go. In other words, that idea is lost on anyone who just asks their phone, how do I get there? People get where they're going, but they don't know how they got there. And I feel that's what's happening in the average Sunday morning. They get there, but they don't know how they got there. And the how is, again, what Mike brought to the Christian world in his, or the world in his work is, guys, enjoy the process of unfolding the map and getting lost in downtown Minneapolis saying, how do I get out of here? Oh, I remember those days. Well, let's finish it up. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate your thoughts. To the woman, he says, and again, notice how literal these ideas are, which probably have non-literal symbolic meaning, right? It's often preached this way. And again, we're back to that same question. What did the woman leave this conversation knowing? I'll surely multiply your pain in childbearing. She had not had children yet, probably. Didn't know how that was going to go. In pain you will bring forth children. Your desire will be contrary to your husband. This is a tough phrase in Hebrew. No one's quite sure. No. I like the ESV as much as any other. The Old King James, your desire shall be for your husband. He shall rule over you. In ESV, your desire shall be contrary to. In other words, you're going to feel under and yet want to be over, something like that. There's going to be, here's all I take this to mean in workaday terms, the relationship, again, think of the snake. You used to be friendly, now you're enemies. Your husband is going to be both your best friend and your fiercest competitor. Something's going to happen here that is not going to be comfortable. How that works out, just get married and see how that works sometimes. Again, most of your days are fine. There will be those moments where you say, why are we having this trouble? And you can look to Genesis 3:16 as your It's your poetic answer. To Adam, he said, and again, think of how physical this is. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you will eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles. I don't think they became part of his world, that they weren't there already. I think he's, again, getting like the snake that's going footless, legless. He's being reminded how going out of the garden is going to introduce him to all sorts of kinds of thistles and thorns that are already in the world, but now it's going to be part of his daily life. So he sweated before this, but now it's going to be part of his daily grind.
Yeah.
And here is the problem. Let me recommend, and Mike was all about this, I remember in his teaching, the problem of mankind that needs to be reversed is not original guilt. It's not Adamic guilt. It's not your depravity. It's not sin management. What is it? It's you're made of dust. If you want to undo the story, and I think, again, this is just what he would have heard. Adam wouldn't have been able necessarily to theologize in the next 60 seconds, like what I'm going to do. Here's to me, though, where this really goes in the full story. Out of dust you're taken. That's where you're going back. It's going to end. You are going to go down into the very dirt you came from. With the period at the end of that is the problem. In other words, if I'm Adam, I'm thinking, well, that ain't any good. In other words, what's the point of living if I'm just going to return to where I came from? And I often tell my atheist friend, don't tell me you've got hope in life. I mean, you can say it. And he admits that he likes racquetball and he likes his friends. But the point is, if the last star is going to die out in 10 trillion years and the whole universe is going to turn cold, admit it now. That's where it's going. And that's what this verse is saying. You are going to die. There's no hope of resurrection here. And to me, that's where, okay, in 3:15, a person can do it there and put Jesus there. To me, this is where Jesus goes. That if you want to reverse the curse, if you want to call it that, or the fall, or whatever you want to call it, notice the word fall is never used here. If you want to reverse this cursing of Genesis 3:14 to 19, we need a resurrection. And bingo, that's where the eyes of the room hopefully will look up and say, oh, okay, now Jesus makes sense to me. So to me, the Jesus part that I love to not tell people, now I'm admitting I don't want to get ahead of the story. This to me is interesting, but not as important as right there. To dust you will return. And if he had given a little more hope to Adam, but he doesn't. And that's, to me, where the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. Yeah. And so the story is moving on this axis more than on the sin management one. That's my opinion.
I would absolutely agree.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the ultimate problem of humanity is that we had access to that tree of life, right? Years ago, when we first planted the church that I'm at right now, we did a Bible study, and I had the great idea. Hey, let's look at Genesis, and everyone in the group got all worked up about why is the tree of knowledge of good and bad in the middle. It's like as though God is setting them up, right? It was so interesting, right? It was an eclectic group. You know, they were all Christian, but at different stages. Like they were new to church or they've been to church for a long time, and so it was like a wide variety. But they all had this commonality of, yeah, why did God put that there? And as though implying God set up Adam and his wife to fail. And I then simply injected this question: was there anything else in the middle?
Yeah.
And then they look back at the text, and then they realize, wait, the tree of life is in the middle too. Yeah, and also notice the ordering, right? The tree of life is mentioned first, and then the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And so, yes, this is a test, but was it a vindictive test? Right? And also, like, they had access to the tree of life. And we know later, and this is getting ahead of ourselves, but like that was something that in the end is like, oh, that's a bad thing now if they eat the tree of life. But
yeah, in fact, thank you. That sends us back into the text to finish it up. For this edition, the man called his wife Chava, translated through, I think, Latin, Eve.
Yep.
The man called his wife's name Chava, because she was the mother of all Hayas. In other words, the word living, it's a play on words.
Yeah.
She's the mother of, and by the way, again, was Adam surrounded by other people outside the garden? I think you can argue that, or at least presume it, even with this land here, because all can be all kinds of, all within my family. My family line is her privilege to bear. So in other words, this doesn't prove that there were no humans living outside the garden.
Can I mention,
and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife. I'm sorry?
Can I mention just this one little bit, is that this is the moment when woman becomes Eve, where she's named Eve, right? Like, she's not named this until after these poetic curses or promises, or however you want to describe it. It's after hearing this stuff, and especially probably after hearing what God said to the serpent. And so it's notice that the New King James does have the word "and." It's a consecutive vav there again. It's just, and the next thing after this curse is over, Adam says, it's missed here in the ESV, but the next thing he says, or at least next thing in the story, is this: dust to which you shall return. And again, there's this hint, I think, strongly there, that it's not going to end up in a bad way. Eve is going to give progeny to him. Yeah, and he's obviously thankful for it. And I bring this up because sometimes, again, that tendency, in also just tradition of blaming the woman or blaming Eve, of like, this is how come we're all in this mess, and almost implying this animosity between man and woman, that it's supposed to be a normal thing or a good thing even. And yet I challenge with the fact that he renames his wife Eve, and it has a beautiful meaning.
Yeah.
So I think Adam owned up. I think both he and his wife, they both were equally responsible for what had happened. And essentially there's something, if there's any hope for me, I'm going to return to the dust, is that something will continue, and it's going to be through her at the very least.
Yeah. It's like 320 is Adam's answer to 319.
Yeah.
And he's, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Whatever I did, I don't mean to do it. There we go. Well, let's finish it up. The Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins. We presume that's animal skin, but notice it doesn't say animal skins. It just says some kind of a garment that had skin. So maybe they, I don't know. Again, remember, they were made of dust. They were a unique, my view is, 2:4-2:7 is telling the story of a creation, the forming of two people, well, one and then another, who were probably looking different based on that creative moment than the other humans out there in the world. And at this point, he gives them garments of skins. I've heard this preached as though this is the first sacrifice, and it hints at how sacrifice will save people. And again, I'm just be careful. All it says is he gave them clothes. So again, if you want to do a midrash on this and say, here's where sacrifice starts, animals can't zip off their clothes. They got to be, killed. Go ahead and midrash it, but please don't change the story for it. Don't make sacrifice the means of atoning your sins to God, when that's not what's even going to happen in Leviticus. And we'll get there.
I think,
Mike
however,
the
word that we often don't notice, though, is that word garments. And it's interesting. It's not the normal word for just general clothing. It's actually a word that is connected to the dress of priests.
Robe and coat. There it is. Aaron the coat.
Yep.
He put on Aaron the coat and robe of the ephod. Yeah, it's not a word that's this is again the on the left here, the Hebrew word behind garments. It's hardly ever translated again as garment, and almost always as a robe or coat.
Yeah, and or a shirt like tunic in Halet, the standard Hebrew lexicon. It's Dr. McDowell pointed this out in her work that we talked about before, that it's a very strange thing that man and woman, or now Adam and Eve, are given not just any just general stuff that you would pick up from I don't know, Sears, but but they're given something that's
halat.
Yeah, there's given something that's connected to or something that was associated with priesthood. And
Yeah.
and I was like, well, that's interesting. It's like, what does
It's not a lot in halat, but it's enough to say it's not the normal word for coat or for dress.
It's a curious word choice.
Yeah.
So anyhow, we can continue, but I just wanted to put that out there because I my mind just went like, I'm still like processing
well, that's the beauty
a lot.
of Bible study. Yeah, man. I'm sure you've been there, Mike, where you sit down to read about one thing and you end up reading about something completely other, and it takes your whole day, and you're glad as ever you did it. So the Lord God said, 22, behold the man. Here, this is interesting. Behold, the man has become like, notice he doesn't say one of the Trinity or like me.
Mm-hmm.
He has become like one of us. I think he's talking to the council, the host, the entourage here.
Yep.
The spirits that he had created that Adam and Eve knew. Behold, he has become like one of us in knowing. He brings up that phrase again as though that is some kind of a privilege that the divine world had that Adam and Eve didn't have until now, and now they do have it. So again, everything is falling into place. The very thing God said would happen and the serpent said would happen has happened. And now we, by the way, how do we know that we inherit this from Adam and Eve? We just presume it's true, that we still have this. Because nothing in the text says that Adam and Eve's kids got this too, but we presume that Adam and Eve's kids, who are they? Cain and Abel and Seth and on, they all got this same knowledge of good and evil. So it's probably our guess.
Mm-hmm.
So some kind of encyclopedic divine knowledge is Luke, is it 11, where 7 spirits enter a man and the case is worse for him at the beginning or at the end than in the beginning. That to me is the kind of verse that only works because of this, that my ability to have a relationship with demons or angels or God himself or Jesus is based on the idea that I have the knowledge of good and evil, which is in this verse, it's a divine privilege that I now have through notice I'm not going to call it the fall. I don't believe in a fall, Mike. I believe in an awakening. Nowhere in this text does it say that men and women fell. It simply says they became like one of us. They grew. They didn't fall. They opened up to something that they shouldn't have had. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life, and it's kind of cut off as though to say, oh, I wish God had filled that in, because why can't he eat of the tree of life? And we presume it would because something would go wrong in the story, right? I don't know what you've heard, but I've heard that they'd be stuck in some kind of a non-believing state or something, or I don't know. But again, notice the text doesn't tell us the problem. It just says, let's continue the story by, therefore God sent him out of the garden to work the ground from which he was taken. 24, he drove out the man. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim. That's always a word you got to remember. What's the Hebrew word behind cherubim? Cherubim. In other words, we don't even know what it is, and that's why we transliterate the Hebrew letters keruv into cherub or cherubim. And a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way. And the Jews love this. They have entire Midrashic commentaries based on this word right here.
Yeah, to guard.
The cherubim weren't guarding Adam and Eve away from the tree of life, so says the Jewish tradition. They were making you turn the page of your Bible saying, why would they guard the way to the tree of life? As though they want them to go back to it, but in their own proper time. Again, that's the beauty of Jewish Talmudic discussion. They see words like this, and this is in the Hebrew, to the tree of life. And they notice that there must be more to the story than we're given. And they, like us as Christians, we want to know. And we have to keep reading to figure that out. Anything else in this text that you want to mention before we let her go?
Well, I mean, a few things, right? And one, it was actually surprising to me in my research for that sermon was that the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, after this chapter, it is never, ever mentioned again. Never shows up again anywhere else. Not even illusions.
Good point.
But the tree of life does. But not this tree. And there was that also very interesting thing again about, in verse 22, behold, the man has become like one of us. And this was part of Dr. McDowell's research in her dissertation, that the opening of the eyes is more than just simply a realization. She suspects that it's an illusion or drawing from a cultural idea that when the statues, the idols were divinized, that one of the ceremonies they would do is open the eyes, just as they would open the mouth of the statue so the spirit can like come in. The opening of the eyes was to enliven the statue, and thus that would be one of the last things they would do to it, and it would technically become a god on earth.
Yeah.
But the irony,
that's
and I'll
exactly
quote,
what happens here. Yeah.
I'll quote what she says here. So this is from her work towards the end. She said, in the comparative rituals, the opening of the eyes and the subsequent transformation of the statue into a divine manifestation were the express purpose of the rite. In Eden, however, the opening of the eyes, although it did result in divine likeness, brought also nakedness, judgment, expulsion, and eventually death. If the Eden author drew from these particular rituals, the opening of the mouth, the opening of the eyes, writing in his own account of human creation, in order to make a subtle comparison between humans and divine images.
Yeah, it probably wasn't missed. Yeah, you're right.
And it's just like, it was just so fascinating because I remember reading that and I'm just sitting there and I'm trying like, how am I going to explain this to my congregation? But there was a moment of like, what a terrible irony, right? That you eat this fruit, you'll become like me. You'll become like a god. It's like, yeah. And everyone, if they're familiar with all the other pagan, cultures that they were exposed to, then they're like, yeah, this is a good thing. And then it's just like how the Hebrew scriptures do. They take something that we expect just culturally to be good in their time and day, and it turns out like, oh no, this was actually terrible. This was a terrible idea.
Well, that's the strength of God, the ultimate author, and Moses, the proximate author, that we have a text here that does have a story that has background meaning that's far beyond itself. I have no problem, seeing it that way.
Yeah, and it just really...
that quote from McDowell's good.
It makes the taste of the... And this was why I struggled with trying to explain 1 and 2 with chapter 3, was because if we don't understand what was lost of like what they had and then what they thought they were going to get, the impact of the story is not as felt. It's not as like a crater versus a punch in the ground. Like knowing this about the opening of the eyes, it all of a sudden became more than just me pounding the ground. It also became like a meteorite just like smashed into the earth, and you just realize like, holy cow, what happened here?
Thank you. Let me say in conclusion, as we close up this edition, we'll pick up 4 next time. What is the problem, again, that the Bible, the story of the Bible is aiming at? I'd recommend, this is me again, I don't know if a Divine Council worldview mandates it. I'm tempted to say, I don't know how we miss this when we think of, taking the Bible in its original meaning, that the problem that man has come upon is death, and it's not sin. Sin is not the problem. Could Adam and Eve have sinned before this Genesis 3 story? I think Romans 5 says they did, when it says the similitude of that moment. In other words, I forget the verse in Romans, but Paul, who knows this story from his own Torah, is arguing that the kind of sin that Adam committed here and the kind of punishment that he got, i.e. death, is the very thing that's reversed by the kind of righteousness that Jesus had and the kind of reward he brings, i.e. life. So my point is this in closing, and maybe I'm dropping a bomb on the into the conversation that merits more time, and we will. The issue coming out of Genesis 3, that often, and since the medieval church and almost every denomination that I've been familiar with, they come out of Genesis 3 with sin as the problem. And Adam and Eve have sinned, they got guilt, now they need some kind of way to get right with God, and blah, 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 and they get into sacrifice, and I call it the sin management model. That what Yahweh's all about is the sin, And if I can just find someone to do right, I'll find it in Jesus, and I'll apply it to people who are sinners, and the whole substitution stuff. That if that's what you get out of Genesis 3, well, I don't know how you got it, because it never said that Adam fell. It never said this was his first sin. It never said that Adam and Eve are now unsaved. It never said this does not have a couple leaving the garden who are not right with God. There's nothing here that says they're not completely right with God. All it says is he drove out the man, put a cherubim so they can't get to the tree of life. But from my vantage point, again, maybe I'm dumping more on you than you have time. How about we begin next time responding to this? It does not say that Adam and Eve didn't the very next day have the same loving, kind, joyous relationship to Yahweh they had the day before. I think they did. I think everything about, like Jesus will call Adam a righteous man. And everything in the story, to me, breathes a righteous man, but he made a mistake, obviously. But the idea that he fell, I guess I'm just trying to, let's talk about this next time as we start. Do we have to have a fall preceding Genesis 4? And if so, why? Because what we do with the fall is going to determine the solution. And if we make the solution about sin management, then we'll have to have a fall. But if we don't make the solution sin management, if we do it in some other way, which I think we can, then we don't need to have a fall. We can have a man who is still righteous, who made a terrible mistake, but all he lost was his way to the tree of life. He did not lose his righteousness, in my opinion. So is that enough to start with our next one?
I think absolutely. And I think just, I think, just the remembering of how Adam responds to God's pronouncements of that he will return to the dust, just like he was made from the dust. Like that's scary. And yet he looks to his wife and says, "You're Eve now, because you're going to be the solution. You're going to be part of the solution to this pronouncement of the dust, because I don't want to be dust,
even if temporarily. Yeah.
I'm made from dust, but I don't want to return to the dust. I don't want to become part of the dust again. I like this existence that I have just experienced. I love this." And like a few episodes we were talking about, that's now been over 11 months of, Mike had passed away. And for me, my sister passed away on that same day. It's sad that, part of what happened with her was we cremated her according to her wishes. And there was a moment, because I'm the surviving sibling. My parents are still alive, but reality, if this were to happen in the proper order, right, I would be the one left. Yeah. And so it was my responsibility in the funeral and in the burial of putting her remains, her ashes into the niche. It was my responsibility to hold on to her ashes. And there was whenever we do get to Job, I would love to talk about this more, but I was repeating a particular translation of Job's line of simply in a paraphrasing that we are just dust.
Yeah.
And that I find comfort in the fact that we are dust. And because ultimately, and this is drawn from Middleton's personal translation of Job, is that God knows we're dust. We are dust. We can never get away from the fact that we are dust. And yet the creator God, who is not made of dust, actually reached out and talked to a man made of dust. And so, it was just really weird in that moment. I'm holding my sister's, her dust. And I'm really longing for the day to see her not as dust. And that is the hope that I think, ultimately Adam is saying to his wife. There's something here. You're the mother of the living. You're not just Isha. Like the solution ultimately has to come through you. And so the bitterness that we sometimes assume, or that we use sometimes to rationalize our anger or our annoyances with our wives, or wives towards our husbands, no, this was a mutual problem that we entered both into. And yet
Yeah.
The solution is ultimately going to come through the woman.
Yep.
And we cannot
And
forget that.
Wedding. Yeah. The simple wedding vow in sickness and in health, even it breathes this whole idea of we are made of dust and we are together until we lay one or the other into the hands of God.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. Looking forward to 4-1 when we get back together.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.